Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Independent Sage briefing. Through these briefings over the years, we've considered the views and experiences of many groups in relation to the pandemic. That's vulnerable people, the immunocompromised, their families, the elderly, children, healthcare workers, among many others. But today we're going to hear from another section of the population that was actually very severely affected. That's young adults. Those people, especially at universities, struggled with isolation, lack of support and interaction with peers and teachers. And they all missed out on in-person classroom interaction and exchange of ideas, if you like, the social ecology of a university. And they missed out on social events that would have been a key part of their school and university experience. So today we've got a whole group of young people joining us to tell us about how the pandemic was for them and what support they should have been ideally provided. But before we get to that discussion, I'm going to invite Professor Christina Pagel, the Tina Turner of facts and figures, simply the best, to give us a presentation of the latest numbers.
Yeah, but luckily not dead. So, right. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to try and be quite short today because I want to give enough time to our guests. So I'm just going to cover the latest on vaccines, hospitalizations and deaths, one slide on variants, just something on the number of people off with long-term sickness, and just a couple of slides on young people to help motivate today's session. So in terms of vaccines, there is a spring booster program going on for over 75s and immunosuppressed. We're about 6 weeks in, 5-6 weeks in, and you can see that there has been uptake, but it's not massive, right? So about 60% of over 75s have had a booster, but only 27% of immunosuppressed people. So that is a bit worrying, and it is lower than the last boosters. So if we just look back to a slide from IndieSage from November, where we looked at the autumn booster campaign. Now, this was over 50. So let's just look at the over 75s, which is the cohort that we're doing now. And you can see about 5-6 weeks in, you were almost at 80% coverage, and now we're at 60%. So there has been quite a big drop off in people coming forward for their booster. We're also seeing, we've had disparities in take up among ethnic minorities for the whole pandemic, but this seems to be getting worse for the booster. So this is looking at the percent of people 75, 79 in terms of when they've had their most recent vaccine. And you can see that 44% of the white population have had it, but far, far lower numbers for other ethnic minorities in the UK. And again, this is quite worrying, and we do want to address this and provide people with the maximum protection that they can have. And the other thing that I just want to point out is that for people who haven't been vaccinated at all, so all of these red people in this age group, but this is for all age groups, particularly younger adults, that offer ends this summer. So from July onwards, you will not be able to get a primary COVID vaccination at all unless you fall into an at-risk group. And this also affects children turning 18. So if you're eligible, please do go and get your vaccine as soon as possible. On hospitalizations and deaths, good news. Hospital admissions are coming down. They're now lower than they've been in a year. Now, we know that testing is changing in hospitals, but I do think this is a genuine drop, and we are genuinely at low levels, and this is for two reasons. One is that if we look at people in hospital by whether COVID is their primary diagnosis or not, that's this red line, and people who are more incidental, the blue line, both are falling. And we know that testing isn't stopping if you're in hospital because of COVID, right? If you're there for respiratory reasons, you will get tested. And the percentage is pretty stable over the last year at about 32, 33%. And we would expect if this was a real testing artifact that would be going up because there's only those people getting tested. So I think this is genuine. And also, if we look at intensive care, we're seeing the number of people with COVID on intensive care is also continuing to go down, which is yet another indication that the drops we're seeing in hospitals are real. And that is good news. We're also seeing deaths coming down from the most recent wave. So deaths are now about 300 a week. It's certainly not negligible. And I don't want to say it's nothing, but it is coming down. And that is also good news. So the last time I presented, I said, the weekly variant or the regular variant report is coming to an end, but it's been replaced by a new routine UKHSA report, which will include variants and will be published every 2 weeks. So this is really good news because it does give us some information about what is happening. This is the latest plot up to the 18th of May. And really, almost all of these are XBB lineages. So that's taken over from the BA5 and then the BQ lineages at the end of last year. Now it's XBB, it's still an Omicron variant. A couple of them are growing, particularly this pink lot, which is XBB 1.16, which has been called Arcturus. It is growing, but it's not growing that quickly, and I don't think it's going to cause a big wave here. Just one slide on long-term sickness. So ONS released its report on the labour force last week. And one of the things that came out is that there were a record number of people off between the ages of 18 and 64 who are not looking for work because they have a long-term sickness. So you can see it was quite steady for about 6 years at about 2 million people who weren't looking for work for that reason. And then it did start to go up before the pandemic. It was about 2.1 million before the pandemic. And then it carried on going up over the first 2 years of COVID to about 2.3 million. And then this year, it's gone up quite a lot again to 2.55 million. So there are a few 100,000 extra people who are now not looking for work because they're long-term sick. Now, that's not just things like long COVID, although that is part of it. It's also going to be a continuation of this trend that we started before the pandemic, and probably a consequence of a really stretched NHS and record waiting list, which means a lot of people are finding that they're getting sicker because they can't access treatment. So, but all of this is really concerning because it affects our economy and obviously affects the people involved in terms of their quality of life. So just a few slides now on young people. Now, there isn't any specific data on university attendance that we found, but I'm going to look at just people in the last couple of years of school. And this is the percent of days lost because of COVID in 2021 to 2022 for like the top 2 years of school. So you can see here that actually quite a significant proportion of people lost at least 1 week, and about a fifth lost more than 4 weeks of school, which is quite a significant amount. And we can also see that there is a real inequalities impact in that the percentage of time lost was much higher for children eligible for free school meals than for those without. And again, that means a disproportionate impact on people who are most disadvantaged and missing out on school. So just to summarise, spring boosters are still underway for the over 75s and immunocompromised, but there's a drop-off in uptake compared to last time. Hospitalizations and deaths are falling at lower levels now than they've been for a long time, which is good news. The Arcturus variant is still growing, but it's unlikely to cause a big wave. It will probably take over, but I don't think it's going to be a massive thing. There are a record number of people aged 18 to 64 not looking for work due to long-term sickness. And just to kind of reflect as we go into the next section, the pandemic caught young adults kind of aged 16 to 24 at a really important time of life, right? It's the transition between school and university or school and work, and also a transition to adulthood and independent living. And in the middle of that, we had COVID. So we're going to reflect a little bit on that now. So that's it from me on this section.
Thanks very much, Christina. Not dead, but still a legend. Thank you for that brilliant summary. We're going to move into our main session, and we'll be considering and discussing the experiences of young people during the pandemic, the problems they faced, what support they needed. But to introduce our guests, I'm going to invite Dr. Zuabida, Haque and Christina again. So over to you both. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start with the introduction. So today we've got Dr. Keri Wong, who is an associate professor in developmental psychology at University College London. And then we have students and research assistants on two studies that have been exploring the impact of the pandemic on young people. So before I introduce our student guests, Keri, really interesting if you could just give us an overview of what you have seen as a lecturer and what you why you wanted to participate in this session.
Sure. Thanks, Christina, for inviting us to this session. I guess maybe just to preface a little bit about my experience, so to speak, lived experience, I could call it. I was probably a teenager at the time when maybe some of you will remember SARS being one of the first kind of epidemics that we've seen, at least in my time. And as a teenager, I was at the time about to complete my GCSE mocks. I remember having to mask, go to school, have our temperatures checked. And in Hong Kong, overnight almost, we saw hand sanitizers erupt all around the city, and everyone became kind of anxious and heightened, very sensitive about the conditions and the whole SARS situation unfolding in Asia and around the world. So with that kind of in the back of my mind, when COVID hit, now in, end of 2019, I remember all of those memories and experiences coming back to me, flooding back actually. And that really was the time and motivation when I thought, well, now as a researcher, as a psychologist, I really want to be able to do something and within my power, collect time-sensitive data on the situation as it unfolds, particularly on mental health, on how COVID's impacted different groups of populations. And also at the time, we were seeing this unfolding in our classrooms, in our lecture, and on campus as well. Many more students were coming to us to ask for help. International students being stuck on campus and not being able to access anything or even any sort of support. So really, I empathized a lot with the young people and young adults at the time. So I've been involved since in several COVID research projects, some looking at families with young children, others looking at trainee teachers going into the field, and in particular, and you'll hear more about these today, on young people, also young children from Black, Asian ethnic minority groups. So yeah, that's really my focus and motivation in all of this.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially how, you said your memories of SARS kind of came flooding back and prompted you to do this. So now I want to introduce our student and research assistant guests. So that's Jasmine, Jamie, Ishil, and Owen. Jamie, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about the work you guys have been doing.
Of course. So our projects are focused on co-producing mental health and life skills workshops for young people affected by COVID-19. So the themes of these workshops are based on interviews with young people about their COVID-19 experience and kind of what support they would want. So in 2021, this was done through the Cope Well project. And this was in collaboration with Jamal Edwards Stealth Charity, which Owen also took part in. And this year, we are all working as part of the Empower Islington project team, where we replicate the study with the Islington population and of ages 16 to 25. So emerging themes from our interviews with these participants have informed the session, as well as our own experiences as young people.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Zuabida?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we're delighted to have you all here. I think one of the reasons we were really keen to have this session is because, we've had sessions before with younger people, and we've been very conscious that there hasn't been much of a conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on young people. But we were really conscious that when it came to university students, that conversation hasn't really happened. And in some ways, your voices haven't been heard. So it's great that you're here today. And I was wondering, I mean, I'd like to hear a bit more about the Copewell project as well. But I was wondering, Ishil, Jamie, Owen, Jasmine, if we could talk a little bit about some of your experiences during COVID-19, and in particular, the positive and the negative experiences. We're also conscious, of course, that, and you talked about this before, about the sense of social isolation and loneliness that you felt. But Ishil, if we could start with you. You mentioned something to us that I thought was quite unusual, which is more that you found some of your experiences to be quite positive. I wonder, Ishil, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having us. So I think I was a little bit lucky because COVID-19 actually had a positive impact on my relationships, especially on my relationship with my family. So at the time, I was a boarding school student. So I was living away from my family for a time. With the COVID and pandemic, like the lockdown and stuff, I went back home. So I actually got a chance to spend more time with my family and in a way kind of rebond with them. So in that sense, it was actually very positive for me. And interestingly, a significant number of young people that I interviewed with throughout our project mentioned that they also had positive experiences in COVID in terms of their family relationships as well. So, which was very surprising for me, actually.
I mean, that's wonderful. And I think there'll be a lot of people out there where that experience will resonate with them, you know, whether it's parent, child, or siblings, or so on. So thank you very much for bringing that to us. Jamie, you talked, I think you mentioned something about how you struggled a bit with your habits and routine being a bit disrupted and what that meant for you and what that looked like. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. So kind of continuing on from Ishil, during this time, I was changing from a high school student to a university student. So although all classes were online, now they were in a different time zone as I wasn't in the UK for online classes. So I think this really affected my sleep schedule because I kind of was sleeping really early in the morning, like 6 a.m., 5 a.m., and getting up at 4 p.m. for my classes. So simply because there wasn't really anything else framing my schedule compared to my experience in high school. So I think many of my peers also found difficulties developing these like positive habits and kind of got stuck in these negative structures. So I think also like being inside all the time and not having much physical activity really impacted that.
Yeah, and I can imagine. And especially I think at your age, because, you know, you had so much structure with schooling, and then all of a sudden that sense of structure and purpose has sort of gone, which sort of brings me nicely on to Owen, I guess. Owen, you talked a bit more about, you know, and quite poignantly, really, about the isolation, the loneliness, and the impact on relationships and how you navigated that. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about how you felt at the time?
Yeah, of course. So I think for me, the biggest challenge was moving from a small rural town in Ireland to London. At home, it's very easy to access nature. My support networks are well established and like everything is a lot more familiar. But moving to London, all of that was gone. I had to start from scratch. So I moved into student accommodation in my first year and had one other flatmate. But by Christmas, they'd left. So a large amount of time I just spent by myself. And when I had COVID, I isolated in my room for about 2 weeks and was advised not to leave my flat. And having no human contact for 2 weeks was quite debilitating, I would say. Not even having the chance to go outside, I would say, made it worse. And also in that time, it became hard to build meaningful relationships when things are continually subject to restrictions and lockdowns. And it took a while for things to become normal again. I would say by the end of my second year, I was able to socialize normally and have the university experience that I had initially expected and what many of my peers had initially expected. And from what I've heard, I would say this is a common sentiment among my peers and especially those we've engaged with in our research.
Yeah, I actually can't imagine what it must have been like during that time for you. Just be alone, especially and to be ill, to have COVID and be alone. And perhaps towards the end, we can talk a little bit more about what universities could have done differently or could do differently in another pandemic in terms of the sort of support that they could provide. Now, Jamie and Jasmine, I wonder if I can come back to you about some of the sort of opportunities, the different kinds of opportunities, the change in opportunities and reduced opportunities. And I'll start with you, Jamie. I think you said something about missing some of your milestone experiences during that time and how you felt about that. What do you mean by that, Jamie?
I think I briefly mentioned as well, during this time when kind of the lockdown started and everything moved online, this was right before my high school final exams. So these exams were obviously canceled and kind of we were going to classes, for 5-6 hours online every day. And they just told us exams are canceled, don't show up tomorrow. And so we just finished like that. So it was definitely very jarring for me. And I think just not finishing exams and going to university, there's a really big sense of imposter syndrome of like, do I deserve to be here or was I just lucky to make my way here? So we kind of lost that sense of achievement, I think, and completion, closure. And I guess kind of we were not really able to graduate in the sense that other people might have been able to. Our graduation was moved to like smaller groups. And I know of one of my friends who had someone in his household who had a terminal illness. So he wasn't able to come to graduate because he didn't want to make that choice. So I think definitely a lot of these things that you shouldn't have to pick and choose, but unfortunately during that time, a lot of these things were given up.
No, yeah, and lost, I suppose, lost opportunities. Jasmine, which brings me nicely to you. You spoke very interestingly about your first year. It was, I think, your first year during your pandemic, and some of the things that you really felt that you lost out on in terms of friendships, in terms of just that entire experience of the first year, which I know so many young people out there will want to hear much more about. Could you share a little with us, Jasmine?
Yeah, of course. So I started university and then after the first term, COVID happened. And so it was just, you just left home, started meeting people and COVID happened. And I remember everyone thought, okay, like I'll see you in 4 weeks after holidays. It turned out to be more than 6 months. And by the time I got back, I'd forgotten most people's names and there were just much fewer social opportunities. Like a lot of people were just in your own household bubbles, stuck with people you don't necessarily get along with. I had to isolate because someone else in my bubble got COVID, even though I never interacted with them. And so I think in terms of social opportunities, definitely like university students lost a lot of that. I know a lot of people who started a year later than me who actually began university in the pandemic would find it very difficult to even meet anyone, especially when you don't see people in person. And with online classes as well, you kind of just log on. Everyone does their own thing. No one really talks to each other. So I think that was quite a difficult experiences of having such a formidable time where you're supposed to enjoy university and develop your own identity. That was kind of lost. So a lot of people we talked to in our research, whether they're in schools or college or university, they also found it quite difficult to navigate that socially. But at the same time, I think it really depends because some people enjoyed not having to be forced to interact with people often. So I think for people who are more introverted or struggle with having social interactions, that was actually quite beneficial for them, and it makes it even more difficult in the aftermath of the pandemic to come back into society and having to have all these interactions. So I think it depends on the people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot because you said something and it made me laugh just because of the term, but you mentioned the term panic masters. And I wonder if you could just explain to our audience the context of what you meant by panic masters.
I think a lot of people, because when they started university, they didn't feel like they had the experience, because a lot of those opportunities were lost. And it ended up being more and more people wanted to stay in education instead of having to face the real world, as they say. And people end up doing panic masters if they get funding, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. And you know, who can blame them? I think the first year of university, those that have been fortunate to go, it's just an extraordinary year where you do go into your own, you become an adult. It's such an important transitional year. And I think if you feel you've missed that, then it's lost time. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Christina, but hopefully I'll be back to you guys.
Yeah, and actually it brings me on really nicely to the next question, which is about now that learning is back in person, and really there aren't any public health measures anymore in pretty much every country. What are you now seeing in your peer group as they kind of are back in full-time university?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a lot of it also reiterating what Jasmine, Ishal, Owen, and Jamie had mentioned. I think across the years pre-pandemic, I think students come to university, they spend maybe first year figuring out, and really gaining, developing those new friendships, getting to know people, trying new things, before maybe by second year that they try to narrow down their career options or start thinking about their future more concretely. But certainly in the recent cohorts that we've seen arriving on campus, literally within first term, I have first year students emailing me for career guidance and asking me that they want to apply for a master's already when they've only had a term of undergraduate studies. So I think there's definitely on campus a real sense of anxiety among students, many of them wanting to do or gain internship experiences, work experiences. There are obviously a small group who would always be proactive, are even more proactive. But certainly on the other end of the spectrum, there are also many students who feel anxious that they have to decide by first year in order to find, or to figure out what their futures are going to be like. So you get kind of both end of the spectrum, students jumping right back in and overcommitting across all opportunities, as well as students who are not so sure yet, but feel that anxiety and worry about their future prospects as well. And I'd say even in terms of teaching in the classroom, that has been quite challenging, obviously during the COVID pandemic, and also with my own lived experience of SARS. I tried my best to, be still masking during classes, encouraging students to respect each other's choices when they're learning, especially in those in-class discussions where students are obviously meant to enjoy the experience because they're back face to face, but equally many of them are also anxious and cautious that they also might get COVID. I think among student population, many students have also gotten COVID many times, more than once, I would say. Even though they want to take learning into their own hands, they want to interact, they want to be back in the classrooms. So I think it's a real tricky thing about learning and also teaching, where we have to think about ventilation in classrooms and lecture theaters, but also respecting other students' choices in their anxieties about the COVID pandemic as well.
Yeah, I mean, that what really resonates with me, at least. I don't know about Jasmine, Jamie, Owen, or Ishal, if you want to kind of add anything to that. No? Okay, all right. Zuabida, back to you.
Well, I actually might come back to you guys on that, because I think Keri's raised some really interesting issues around the sort of different opportunities, about people really panicking about those missed opportunities. And we talked a little about the missed social opportunities, but of course there were also missed labour market opportunities as well. And that sort of brings us around the issue, or the assumption, if you like, that all the students were in the same boat. And we know that this pandemic is a pandemic of inequality. We've seen that in the stats even today that Christina shared with us in terms of vaccine uptake and ethnicity and deprivation. But Owen, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, do you think you could talk to us a little bit more about the sort of inequalities in the pandemic for students or for yourself, and what that looked like and what that meant? And perhaps, you might even want to talk about some of the research that you've been doing.
Sure, yeah. I think there's huge implications on inequalities regarding opportunity. So from my own experience, it almost feels as though everyone at this age is playing catch up. We've missed so much through lockdowns and what should have been a very formative period. We didn't get to socialize, to experience the freedoms that come with young adulthood and moving away from home for the first time. We didn't get to experience the lecture halls and all the rest of it. And from what we've seen in our research, while there are young people who manage to cope with the lockdowns, and very admirably, equally, there are many individuals who slip through the cracks. So for instance, these people are young carers, or they don't have access to the resources required to engage with these opportunities. And for some people, these extra stressors, such as the isolation, the uncertainty, can culminate in feeling a bit lost and without direction in life. And I think it becomes hard to find these opportunities if you're unsure of where to look or how to network. And effectively, I think what we're left with is a large pool of overwhelmed young people who feel partly, if not wholly, unprepared for the working world, and who are competing for opportunities that are in reality quite scarce.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, those are really important issues to raise. And I think that brings us nicely to Christina, I guess, thinking about, as you said, as we talked about, could universities have done things differently? But I'll hand back to you, Christina.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. It's quite sad to kind of hear you guys talk about what it was like, and I can't really imagine what it would have been like, thinking back to my university time. So what do you think universities or schools, families could have done better to support you? What is the learning from what you guys have experienced and what you've kind of researched that will make it better next time? What can we take away from it? So, Jasmine, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think from personal experiences and also what we've heard from the participants that we've interviewed, I think mental health support was the one thing that was raised again and again and again. Personally, when I was in university during lockdown, the form of mental health support came in being sent a haiku a day and a funny photo from someone from college. And I know that was meant to make people laugh, but I think in terms of mental health support, it has to be much more than that. And I know that a lot of people try to access university counseling services, but often it takes half a year to get to talk to the first person, and everyone only gets 5 or 6 sessions. And then after you're done, you either pay or you don't have therapy, or you turn to NHS and the waiting lines are even longer, even 2 years. And by then the pandemic has kind of slowed down. So I think in terms of mental health support, it would have helped students a lot just to give them a space to talk to each other. And I think quite interesting, was that a lot of young people we talked to just said that it would have helped to have the chance just to speak about it, just to open up and talk about their experiences. Because a lot of the time, especially now, people don't want to think about COVID. It's done and dusted. No one thinks it's a cool topic to talk about anymore at school. But then I think a lot of people are still affected by it, especially those who have had grief and bereavement loss. Is really important just to give people the space to talk about it. And so I think that was one main thing, just to have, say, like a group session where you can talk about each other's experiences. And for some people we talked to, they said that talking to us was the first time. It was the first time they talked about COVID and their experiences. So just having that sort of mental health support would have been quite helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like just a space to kind of process what happened and not kind of pretend it didn't happen, I guess, is what you've been hearing then. Jamie, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it was also quite brought up by participants and also like our peers as well. Some social support from schools or university, just like to bring people together. I think post-lockdown, a lot of us are not so used to socializing in person. Some participants brought up maybe some socialization workshops, just because they haven't done it in a long time, and maybe more support from the university to bring people together. So for us, our entire first year was online. So in second year, when we came back, we asked, I don't recall if we asked particularly, but I remember induction was being done online. So we kind of unofficially organized an in-person meetup, just so when we went in person to classes on the first day, we could see familiar faces that weren't attached to a Zoom screen. So obviously I understand like during that time, there were still a lot of restrictions. So in-person opportunities were reduced, but probably more support on bringing people together. And very fortunately this year with less restrictions, the department did support that through our departmental society, who kind of organized a pizza party, which I think for all 3 years, actually, first year, second year, and third year. So I'm really glad that the new first years had a better induction experience than we did.
Yeah, I mean, I think, listening to you, it does just bring in mind that there is so much that comes with having to move online. And I personally think that certainly in the UK, and I think in many other places, we could have done and should have done a lot more to enable universities to be in person, or at least hybrid, earlier than they were. And that is, things like keeping down transmission everywhere. It's things like good ventilation, which Keri's also mentioned. It's HEPA filtration. It's trying to think creatively about how can you meet and learn in outdoor environments, which we know are a lot safer. And I think we didn't really do that. And I feel like we're not, because no one wants to really talk about COVID anymore, we're not learning for the future, which I think is a real shame, because we need to have some kind of contingency plans. Because as you've discussed a bit earlier on, it happened overnight. Suddenly everything changed, and we need to have those plans in place before that happens to enable a much smoother transition, instead of everyone just feeling kind of like abandoned wherever they happen to be. And for students, often that is away from home, and that can be really isolating. And I don't know, Zuabida, if there's one more thing you want to say.
Well, no, I certainly agree with you. I think there's a lot for us to think about, and hopefully in future Indesage sessions we can think a bit more about our learning from this pandemic and how we can take that into the future. It's a brilliant session today. I really don't know about the rest of you, but really enjoyed that session. I suppose the one thing I want to add for our audience is that I suppose today's session was really about unheard voices, about hearing from young people who have really been invisibilized during this pandemic. And we felt it was important, and they felt it was very important to hear the experiences that they've been through, but also to learn from that, and hopefully for universities to learn from that, from the government to learn from that from the future. The main thing I want to say, however, is we feel very privileged that these young people joined us today. Jasmine, Jamie, Owen, Ishil. Thank you very much for joining us. But it's important to emphasize that they're not a representative group. They asked to join us. We wanted to hear from them. And they're like, I suppose, and this session is not meant to be representative of young people across this country, of young people in university. Just like every other group, students are very heterogeneous. They're very diverse. We already heard from Owen today that, there were some students who were carers who had vastly different experiences. There are students who are compromise who would have had very different experiences. There are students who would have lived in CEV households. So please, if you could just remember, this was an opportunity for young people to speak, but it's not meant to be representative of all students. Leonard, Dr. Leonard Lee, I think you'd like to add something else as well before we
thank
close.
you, Zuabida. That's so kind. And students, thank you so much for giving your time. I really appreciate it. I mean, I just get very angry, actually, because, I mean, just my anecdote, I got pushed on a pandemic mission up to Durham University as part of the Test to Release programme, and 50% of students were locked down in wave 2, 70% in other colleges, 80% in other colleges. And then what I was seeing was that tutors were having to bring food to the door because the catering staff had gone off well, and they couldn't leave their rooms. Huge levels of psychological distress, depression, self-harm, mental anguish, being supported by tutors trying to do it virtually. How big's a student room? A small desk and a bed. And they were locked up in there for weeks and sometimes months. So lockdown was not the same for everyone. And I think the 4 lessons we have to learn, just listen to this, and this is what's so good about Independent Sage. We're talking about these issues and we're learning, which is completely being forgotten about, is of all the sectors we've got, student and the health university sector will be hit the worst because of the high intensity accommodation. That's unavoidable. That's not the students doing what they want to do. It's not them breaking the rules. It's just their accommodation. The second point is that our university staff are heroic. They brought food to students' doors. They kept the students safe. They intervened to stop the mental anguish. I just couldn't believe that. And they are unsung heroes. And I think the third one is you have to support that sector if this happens again. Worrying about how to keep students fed whilst you're worried about getting COVID is not a sensible situation for that sector. And I think the university sectors were really not thought about. I mean, I have to try and put a positive, don't I? I guess one of the most positive things I would say is I think the nation should also remember our medical students who dropped their entire education and went onto the front line to help as doctors. And again, all students did that for our research programs. And again, I think the nation is very grateful for that too. But great testimonial. Thank you for bringing that to us. And I'm sure lots of people out there will be feeling very similar. So, yeah.
Thanks, Leonard. Thanks, Zuabida. Thanks, Christina. Thanks to all the students. That was great. It was really sobering. I just got one comment. I think the university has been irrevocably changed by this pandemic, because with the rise of home working, I go into the university and it's a bit of a ghost town. And given that the fees have stayed plateaued and we've got rising inflation, universities are going to hit a tough time, and students are going to complain if their lecturers are 4 days a week at home. And now that's not always the case. And I know a lot of people here are all going in to do in-person teaching. But I think the university has been changed. I used to love all the corridor conversations, going into common rooms, going to student activities, meeting in the refectory, all of that. And that has changed. And I think we really have to think about that in future, about what we want a university to be. And if we're turning it into a largely online experience, then students will quite reasonably say, why am I paying £9,000 a year? You know, maybe it should be 5. And then you're in a real... Anyway, let's not go into that. That was a great session. We'll come back to some of these issues later. I'm going to move on to the Q&A session because we've got some really interesting and quite challenging questions. And I'm going to start with Will Newcomb. All of them are being read out, I'm afraid, but this is a really interesting and quite difficult question about vaccines. And even I want to know the answers to this. So he said, I've read statements from the World Health Organization that vaccines based on the original variant in Wuhan are no longer effective. We need to use vaccines that combat the latest XBB variants that Christina told us about. But he says, I follow an expert who states quite clearly that there's little or no clinical difference in the effectiveness of bivalent vaccines, we need to explain that, to the original ones. Who is right? Is the expert only referring to the mRNA vaccines in the USA? That's Moderna, Pfizer, but there are many other vaccines available elsewhere. Does the briefing panel have any perspective on this? Would be much appreciated. And he has a coda saying, what's the difference between a serotype and a variant? So those are, I'm looking at two people now, Professor Sheena Cruikshank and Professor Steve Griffin. Who wants to go first? Should we go to you first, Sheena?
Yeah, I'll take the bit about the vaccines, I guess. So we did have a variety of vaccines that were being offered this round in the boosters. Some of them were the bivalent vaccines, and some of them were not. And it all depended on what vaccine you had and what vaccine was available as to what you would get as to the decision for that. And at the time, the decision to create the bivalent ones was to try and broaden our immunity, because obviously we'd had vaccines or we'd been infected with the original strains, and that trains our immunity towards those strains.
What do you mean by bivalent vaccines?
Bivalent vaccine means it's got a little bit of the original strain, the ancestral strain, and a little bit of Omicron in it. Or it could have a different one, but usually it was the Omicron strain.
So these would be Pfizer, Moderna, mRNA vaccines, but not AstraZeneca.
Not the AstraZeneca one, no. And so these were being offered, and the idea was to try and broaden our immune response, because when our immune response meets a virus or any other infection, it makes decisions about what it reacts to. And we're seeing very dominant responses towards parts of the spike protein, and these changed. Spike proteins, the little bit of the virus that it uses to get into cells. Now that changed a little bit with Omicron, and so the rationale was that we'd have a broader response that could also cope with Omicron. And the initial studies that looked at that showed that those boosters were working really well. They were responding well, and they were looking better than the original vaccines had in response to Omicron. However, of course, the virus has continued to mutate, and we now have these XBB variants that are quite dominant now. And it doesn't look like there's necessarily an advantage to retaining that ancestral strain, that original type of COVID in our vaccine design. And the reason that it might not be a good idea to include it is also because there's a worry that by continuing to include it, we kind of force our immune system to be trained down one direction. It's called trained immunity. And that means that we might be less able to have a great response to the XBB strains. So that's the reason that they're taking it out. So the boosters were good for what they were designed for, but now perhaps we need to move on with the science because the virus is changing and we're learning more.
So when I get my booster next week, as I might, what kind of vaccine am I going to be offered? Is it ancestral? Is it bivalent? Or is it?
It will probably still be the bivalent, because I don't think we've got those vaccines yet. I think they're thinking what we're going to do for the September round,
right,
when there's the anticipation that XBB and any descendants of XBB will be the dominant force. So this has only sort of been decided, and the science and the papers that have come out that have shown that are all quite recent. So this is projecting forward.
Right. So if I get a booster, there is a slight risk I'm going to train my immune system to respond to the wrong virus in future.
Well, it's not the wrong virus. It's just that it might not be quite as good,
right,
as it would be if we just didn't bother with that extra little bit. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't work, and it doesn't mean that it's not topping up your immunity.
Yeah.
I think it's important to forward plan. I mean, that's what this is about. Yeah. It's thinking forward.
Steve, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Sheena says. The reason that they're doing that is because we're wanting to tailor the immune responses that we're having away from the virus that came from China towards these newer viruses that are happening now. So that's absolutely right and proper at the moment, with a couple of caveats. One is, can we keep up that antigenic changes? And it also depends what we're trying to measure. So if we're trying to measure protection from infection, that's different. So if we're trying to measure protection against nasty COVID, really severe COVID, And all the vaccines that we have are really good at the latter. They all give us really good protection from that. Now, the one virus geek concern about what we're doing here is that if you remember when Omicron first emerged, people that hadn't had a vaccine but had just a Delta infection, and if you think about the evolution of SARS as a big wheel, Delta and Omicron are kind of on the other side of that wheel. And people that had only seen an infection with Delta and had Omicron infection afterwards didn't do as well as people that had the vaccine, because the vaccine is kind of the hub of that wheel, if you like. So the distances between the immune response were less, and so you were better able to be protected against Omicron. Again, less important for the severe disease aspects, but certainly very important for the protection against infection. So the risk with doing this is that A, we don't keep up well enough, which I hope we will, because we need to forward plan, we need to change our vaccines, and we need to make sure that we're adapting, et cetera, et cetera. The issue is whether or not we're going to see another Omicron-like event in the next years, or the next coming years of this pandemic, because these variants take time to accumulate all the patterns of mutations that they have within them, and they emerge suddenly, as we saw out of Africa with Omicron at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. So the risks involved, and is definitely outweighed by the benefits at the moment, is that by dragging our immune response, and you can actually keep vaccinating and drag your immune response towards these different variants, that we may move it too far in one direction. And if that new virus were to emerge and it was very different, we might have to reset the clock again. But that's it's a smaller chance than the fact that we know there's going to be more waves of XBB. We know there's going to be more waves of Omicron variants coming through. So at the moment, it's the right plan as long as we can keep up with it. And the difference between a variant and a serotype, serotype is kind of an old-fashioned term when we used to define viruses just by the nature of the anti-sera that we would use to detect them, rather than understanding their genetics and the mutations that we have in the molecular level.
So the variant wizards, and we haven't got Professor Aris Katsarakis with us, but I know from our conversations with him and others like him, they say, look, we're not out the pandemic, and there's also a not insignificant risk that we're going to get some nasty new variant in the next couple of years.
I completely
some
agree.
Put it at sort of 10 to 20%, but others put it higher than that. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about 2021, everyone thought Delta was the kind of pinnacle of SARS-CoV-2 evolution. And then, SARS went, hold my beer, here's Omicron. So I think that we cannot conceivably prepare for all eventualities. I think it would be great if governments were making contingencies for this in the same way that we do against, potential emergencies of pandemic influenza, for example. Have the plans in place and hopefully be ready if this does happen.
Great. Thank you very much. I hope, Will, that's answered your question. That was a very interesting discussion. The next question is from Joanna Robson. Just checking the time. Wow. I'd like to know if it's possible to quantify the damage done to the body by one COVID reinfection. Is it, for instance, as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for a certain period? Which is quite a nice analogy if you could do it. Or is this the wrong way to think about the virus and the level of damage done to the body is completely random? Any Helen or Martin, maybe?
I'm happy to take it. Yeah, is it possible? I don't think it really is, because there are so many other things going on, even with smoking. First of all, there is a degree of genetic variation in your response anyway. There's an interaction with other conditions that you might have. And, if you think about smoking, it impacts on cardiovascular disease as well as on the lungs. So there are other things going on. And although you can say for a population that there is a certain risk, for an individual, there will be a degree of variation. And then when you look at an infectious disease where you've got a combination of the variant of the virus that's involved, the immune response and everything else that's going on, I think it would be really quite challenging. I think you just add to that complexity with an infectious disease, certainly an infectious disease where you've got a continually changing pattern of variants and a continually changing level of immunity. But somebody else may be able to add to that.
Thank you. Well, they've asked about quantifying, so our number nerds are here, number wizards are here. Kit or Duncan or Christina? Kit.
I was just going to suggest that there is a framework that Professor David Spiegelhalter has come up with about quantifying impacts of various activities upon life expectancy. I think he calls it micromorts. So he splits up life expectancy into a million different parts and suggests how many micromorts you might lose by doing a particular activity. So although you probably wouldn't want to make a direct comparison between smoking a pack of cigarettes and getting a COVID infection, you might be able to quantify either or both of those things using this micromorts framework, which gives you maybe an indirect comparison. I wouldn't attempt to do that off the top of my head now, but there potentially is a framework for doing that in terms of quantifying risks.
Leonard, is that your...
I just want to make a really silly point that maybe we'll find out the Olympics next year what happens to athletic performance of peak individuals pre and post pandemic. Maybe that's an interesting way when we see.
You think it'll go down?
I actually don't know. I wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought young people, peak fitness athletes will recover very quickly and there'd be no change. But I mean, performance should improve every time. I mean, life expectancy has gone down in population, but how about peak athletic performance? Who knows?
I always think that active life expectancy is a much better measure than life expectancy, because life expectancy has gone from, let's say, 80 years down to 77 or something for men. But active life is very socially determined. So if you go to deprived parts of the UK, your active life expectancy may be as low as 52, 53, because after that, you've got diabetes, you're immobile, you may have all kinds of problems. And a lot of that is socially determined. So we have to factor in not just the biological aspects of this, but the social determinants of health. Anyone else on that? If not, I'll go to one more question. Yeah, we've got a couple more minutes.
Helen's got her hand up. Anthony.
I beg it. Sorry, Helen. You're muted. Yeah.
No, it was only to say that lots of people feel they totally get away with their smoking and it hasn't damaged them. And lots of people feel that despite having 30 units of alcohol a day, it hasn't impacted them. We don't know. And sometimes it shows up much later. I think what we can say, what this comparison is quite useful to say, actually, you wouldn't choose to do those things which we know are damaging to your health, even if we can't quantify it. And we wouldn't choose for you to have another COVID infection if you could avoid it, because probably you're going to be okay and probably you won't get lung cancer from cigarettes. But on the whole, we know there's a statistical association of being really unwell, of having long COVID, of having all the other sequelae of COVID and having repeated COVID infections. So even if we can't pin it down to a number, and I think it would be really difficult, even if you try to use Spiegelhalter's micromorts, I think it would be really difficult to pin it down. There's a kind of message behind that question, which is you wouldn't do it. Ideally, you would have tried and avoid it. And we need to be trying harder to avoid those infections. And if we're not going to do it by making our lives so much poorer by not having corridor meetings and all the stuff that makes university life fun, then we've got to do it in other ways, like looking at ventilation and thinking about how we reduce risk.
Yeah, and there's a GP speaking who deals with personalised care, because you're dealing with an individual patient in front of you. And so it's not just about population risk, it's about what you say to an individual. No, I think that's a really important point. Any other? I'm aware that we are actually at time, and the next question requires a longer answer. It's from Ben Boyle, and it's all about vitamin D and the links with COVID and long COVID. So I think we'll carry that over to the next session. I want to thank everyone for an excellent meeting. The pandemic has not gone away and its impacts are still with us. I think that's been, I'm very grateful to all of you for your contributions today. We're going to see you again in 2 weeks, same time, same place. Till then, I want you to keep safe, have a lovely sunny bank holiday weekend out in the open, breathing safe, fresh air. So see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks to our guests. Thanks. Bye.